Thanks for the introduction, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. I think I speak for the whole panel in saying that strikes us as a really important effort, and we're really glad to help get it started and move it along. He stole my standard opening line, which is the bit about, how do you get people who've been killing one another with considerable skill and enthusiasm in civil wars to work together. But that really is the focus of what I, among many of us, the rest of us have been doing. And the point I want to make about that, too, really, one is it's intuitively implausible that it happens, and B, it happens all the time. And then, in fact, basically all major states are the products of one or two or three of these reconciliations, if you care to call it that, on a large scale. But what I really want to talk about here is peace building, peacemaking, and the role of SSR, where SSR fits. And I'm going to do this in a by giving you a kind of historical overview on this, because I think it's hard otherwise to understand where we are at this very odd position. And I want to start this by saying that the whole notion of peace building and peacemaking changes in a fundamental way with the end of the Cold War. And in a real sense, much of what happened before that is irrelevant, almost. And the sort of indicator of this is when you look at how civil wars end before and after the Civil War, there's a radical difference. It's a sea change. Before the end of the Cold War, civil wars almost always ended in military victories of one side or another. After the Cold War, the opposite is true. Depending on how you count, as you can imagine, there's discussions about this, 2 to 3 times as many civil wars that end now do in negotiated settlements as they do in military victories. And I don't have to tell you why, you know this. But one of the interesting aspects of this has been the rise, and I'm not sure how much is cause and how much is effect, of what I call the peace industry. A whole slew of organizations around the world, some working in governments, some working outside of governments, some dancing delicately along that fine edge, concerned with this issue of sort of essentially how do you bring wars to an end. And if you want an interesting contrast, look at, say, the negotiated settlement in Colombia in 1957, which produced a power-sharing arrangement which worked quite nicely for a couple of decades, and was done entirely by the Colombians themselves, with, as far as I can tell, almost no interest in what they were doing, much less involvement. Now, of course, now that Colombia's in another civil war, these days you start killing people and folks start parachuting in. I mean, there are all these organizations that all of a sudden come and say, we're here to help. And that has some interesting implications in terms of what the process looks like. As a result of all this, there's a kind of a standard package for settlements, what you might call the Washington Consensus for ending civil wars. Hostilities should end. There should be a power-sharing government. There should be elections. Military force should be formed of merging personnel from competing military forces into a single military. One study, for example, of 30 of these negotiated settlements found that 18 included provisions for such merger. There should be outside help in this and sometimes supervision. And the mission here really is state building, sometimes called nation building, erroneously, as you know. Now, typically, the outsiders come in with many different missions, all of which are plausibly seen as important, and very little coordination. And there's not coordination because the organizations are independently based and independently funded. What are some of these missions? Well, humanitarian relief, disarmament and demobilization of fighters, economic development, rule of law, democratization, changing gender relationships, human rights, resettlements of refugees and internally displaced persons, changing education to reduce societal divisions, establishing a power-sharing government, constructing a viable taxation system, security system sector reform, transitional justice, democracy training, bolstering society. I mean, you know the list. It goes on and on and on. And all of these are important, okay? So everybody comes in and they say, look, you have to do what I'm doing in order to build peace here. And at some level, that's true. But this in turn produces a lot of conflict. Why is there conflict? Conflict now among the outsiders who are coming in. Because each of these is supported by separate organizations and they are competing for limited resources, distinctly limited resources. There's no central control. There's no central control of the military to tell the NGO, basically act as a spy, to tell the NGO what the mission leaders wanted so that they could get ready to compete for the contracts. The result tends to be a lot of money widely dispersed with little coordination and less than optimum impact. That's what happened initially, okay? If you look at the first 10, 15 years, that's really what a lot of these peace building operations look like. Some run by individual countries, some run by alliances, some run by the United Nations. The differences there, I think, are less than their similarities. But I think one of the things that's changed is there's an increasing realization that security really is a prerequisite for anything else to work. That you really cannot do any of these other things without security. And that's been a very hard lesson for the peacemaking community to learn. And we're still working on it. And there are reasons for that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The two sort of poster children for this, at least for Americans, are Somalia, all right, where basically nothing has been accomplished because security is non-existent, and Iraq, where immense resources didn't do very much until some kind of minimal level of security was established, and even now it's not clear that how far you're going to get with this. So A, there's a realization that security is important, and B, there's an increasing realization that we don't know how to do it. There's a serious intellectual gap here. One way to think about this is to say there's sort of two levels of security. What do we mean by security? And I would argue there are at least two different levels, and we don't really know how to do either one very well. The first is persuading elites that they can safely disarm, that they can take the enormous risk of putting themselves and their families at the mercy of their enemies by giving up their weapons and their armed forces and consenting to DDR. And that's really hard. The second is civilian security, as Charles Cole calls it. Creating a situation where ordinary people can do the things that need to be done to improve the country without fear. Now, this is, as I say, has not been a major, it's not been a popular topic among the people who deal in peacekeeping and conflict resolution. There's a culture clash here that's important to note sociologically. First place, disarmament is seen as a major goal. The idea is to get guns out of the hands of people, not put them into them. But secondly, at a more fundamental level, a lot of the people who work in conflict resolution are very uncomfortable to the notion of working with people with guns, the military and the police, all right? And there's a sense that they are, in some sense, the enemy. And getting around that, bringing those folks together and having them talk to each other is still a work in progress, although we've made a lot of progress. And there's nothing like a series of peace operations to persuade people on both sides they really need to talk to each other. On the military side, I think it's fair to say that this is not a subject that's been of much interest to military and police experts historically, again, until recently when all of a sudden it's become really clear that we've got to do something about this. And frankly, Bob Perito was one of the people who's really led this charge. Now, what are we talking about here? Well, in elite security, the standard response to this is power sharing. All right, you share power among the competing groups to give them a sense of security so they can stop the fighting. And we now have a track record on that. We know something about it. And short-sorting a lot of academic argument, which I'll be delighted to engage in if you really want to, if you got the stomach for it. The consensus at this point is this is not a very good way. This is a pretty good way to get peace, but it is not a very good way to run a government. You know, our poster child for this is Chad, which did this over a period of years and wound up with a cabinet of 40 ministers, which is pretty impressive for a country those size and those resources. We're unclear at this point how to encourage movement towards a more unified government over time. And I sometimes in my classes refer to the example of the United States of moving from the Confederation to the Constitution and point out that it was in fact an illegal process. Merging competing militaries is one common strategy, as I say, and there are a whole series of interesting problems there. Selection of members, who will control it, how much power should it have, some of which Walter Slocum talked about. We don't know much about this. This is a personal plug for me, because this is what I'm doing my research on these days. But let me give you an example. Somebody asked the question of who do you go for, where do you look for cases? And my work suggests that a lot of these people who are involved in this from the West feel like they're doing it by the seat of the pants. They don't have a clue. But I'll tell you an interesting case of somebody looking for a relevant example. In Nepal, as you know, there are negotiations underway to bring about mergers of the militaries there. And in the negotiations, the Maoists asked, the Maoists, not the government, asked that people from the South African MK, that is the military arm of the African National Congress, be brought in to talk to them about how it worked in South Africa. And they were asking that the rebels in South Africa be brought in to talk to them because they thought this was an analogous situation. And this was in fact done. And I have not yet heard the definite results of it, but the notion of reaching out for this kind of cases is really interesting. It's also really unusual. And we don't at this point, for example, have standard training programs in the militaries to set up people to do this kind of stuff. And academically, we don't have a lot of knowledge about how these cases work. Civilian security, some of the problems Walter talked about are really critical. I don't want to talk about those much, but one of the things I want to touch on here briefly is how during the transition period there really is this problem, and we have not solved this problem of what do you do when you start. Outside militaries are reluctant to work in what is really police work. It's especially true of the Americans, but not exclusively so. And more importantly, in police work, individuals from different countries have very different ideas about how to do police work. I mean, when Germany was occupied after World War II by the four powers, each one of the four powers set up a separate police force based on its own very distinct model. And so there isn't a model that you can sort of bring in and plop in on this. More importantly, security isn't just people with guns. You have to have a court system. That means a set of lawyers, judges, people who have to be trained, who have to understand how these processes are going to work. You need a prison system. Okay? Creating this on the spot, this is not something you fly in. And eventually, of course, all this has to be done by locals. Again, I think it's fair to say that these processes are not something the internationals have been really interested in until recently. If you're an NGO, it's a lot easier to get money by showing pictures of your groups feeding children, starving children, than it is to show training police. But I think but I think there has in fact been a real change in this in the last, I think, 5 to 7 years. And this conference is, I think, one example of that. I think that at the elite level, there's been a lot of discussion in SSR. There is a substantial academic literature now. This literature, much of this literature focuses on civilian control of military and police. I think that's an important issue, although I get more concerned about which exactly civilians we're talking about here. It seems to me it makes a difference. And there are increasing attempts to bring together experiences in different places and try to generalize from them. Increasingly, there's sort of the first level of concern is, can you create these forces? The next level of concern is, what can they do when you have created them? Are they competent, as Walter Slocum says? And that's become a real issue. In civilian security, again, there's a general increase in interest, a focus on changing personnel, either by putting in new people or retraining. Some interest in changing doctrine. How do you police? What should you be training here? I have an alum who worked in Haiti for a while for the UN and swore he would never do it again, and now makes a modest living as a consultant, basically training people in other countries how not to beat people up too badly when they're doing their job. And they're substantially more interested in reforming the judicial system, and this is a really difficult problem in many countries, in part because the judges tend to be appointed for long terms, and so you're sort of stuck with them. And in many cases, the judicial systems that are in place give individual judges enormous leeway in making decisions. The other thing that's changed, I think, is a sense that we're in this for the long run. That this is not something you're going to be able to get into and get out of. That's the one thing that's really clear. And so there's been increased concern verbally, and I think in terms of policy, how do you get ownership of these reforms? How do you set these things up, change things in such a way that you can step out so it's not going to collapse instantaneously? How do you bring the locals on board? What I want to leave you with is, we don't know. Okay? We really don't know. And it's not a problem of saying, here's the solution, let's kick these damn governments and get them doing. It's a problem of political will. It is a problem of political will, but it's also a problem of analysis. And the stage we're at now, it seems to me, we have trouble making recommendations to policymakers with a straight face, particularly when they involve putting people's lives at risk. And that's what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with issues that affect the way people live and the way people die. It puts a heavy responsibility on us to do the best job we can in telling folks what the likely consequences of their actions will be. Thank you.